Hello and welcome to Uncommon Law, my podcast about true stories from my life experience of over 50 years as a lawyer and trial judge. This is a look at the law from the inside out, stuff they don't teach in law school. This is Judge Rudy Greco, retired Justice of the New York State Supreme Court. I always ran lucky on Staten Island. New York City's sleepy borough of Richmond has always been kind to me as a criminal defense attorney. But my fondness for Staten Island goes back to my early childhood. I was 5 and 6 years old. I was a little kid in the 1950s in Brooklyn. And my best friend Howie lived around the corner. And he was an only child. And he had a collection of hand-painted lead figurines from armies from every conflict, the Civil War, the Revolutionary War, Cowboys and Indians, World War I, World War II. And because he was an only child, I was often invited to go to his apartment where he lived and play with the toys. It was a big treat. Also, it was an extra treat because Howie's parents lived above the business that they ran. They owned the building on Smith Street in Brooklyn, and the business that they ran was wholesale candy and tobacco supplies for the candy stores. So Howie was never out of candy or anything like that. It was not too shabby to be a good friend of Howie's. And the other thing was Howie always let me command the losing army. It was the Nazis or the Confederates or the Indians, but it was a good experience anyway. It was fun playing. I never took that too personally. So every year in early October or mid-October, just before Halloween, Howie's parents would invite me to come along with them for a trip in their car. They had a big 51 Dodge, big black sedan, and we would go to the 59th Street Ferry in Brooklyn, which existed at that time, and for an ocean voyage across the bay to Staten Island, where we would head for the little town of Tompkinsville. Now, Staten Island in those days was practically bucolic. It was before the Verrazano Bridge and the time when half of Brooklyn moved out to buy homes in Staten Island later on. But at this point in time, Staten Island and Tottenville especially was right out of a Norman Rockwell painting. It was bucolic. It was really pretty. And we'd go through the roads and I can still smell the scent of leaves burning and the smoke in the air. Everybody used to burn leaves in those days, and it was a great smell. I loved it. I wish we would do it now, but you can't do it anymore because we know better. He said, and we would go to Tompkinsville in Staten Island, where there was a contest every year. All the shops had painted shop windows with Halloween scenes, ghosts, goblins, witches, pumpkins, what have it, pilgrims, all sorts of stuff. And we would they would use, I think, glass wax at the time and color it with food coloring and get the different colors that they used in the paintings. And we would be riding around looking, admiring all the storefronts, and all of us would be voting and picking our favorite storefront. And it was a totally pleasant experience. And again, I look back on Staten Island with fondness. So 25 years later, I'm a criminal lawyer, and I'm practicing in all the dirty, grimy courts in Brooklyn, Queens, Manhattan, and the Bronx. And I had to go to Staten Island. I had been in Staten Island on 3 different cases, minor cases, criminal cases, and I'd run very lucky, as I said, because I won them all. I was undefeated. And the Staten Island courthouse was not dirty, grimy, or anything. It was an antique. It was really quaint. It was really pleasant, and I always had good outcomes there. Well, this time, I was called to Staten Island by a bookmaker client of mine whose son was arrested for armed robbery with 3 other teenagers. And apparently, they were accused of robbing a mom-and-pop small supermarket, a superette, owned by an old Italian couple, a husband and wife. And the boys were walking along the street dressed in plaid shirts, shirt tails hanging out over their blue jeans. And that was the style. All the kids had the same style. And they matched the description of the supposed perpetrators of the robbery at the supermarket. Teenagers dressed in plaid shirts and jeans. But they were all over Staten Island. Teenagers were dressed in the same outfits. Well, these kids, the cops swooped in. They were right near the store, about a block or 2 away, when they swooped in and arrested all of these kids. And my friend called me up, and he was deeply troubled. And he said, Rudy, my son was arrested. I want you to represent him. And he says, I had a talk with my son, and I'm worried because I know my kid. I have a very close relationship with him. And he says, I didn't do it, Dad. I have nothing to do with this. And I said to myself, uh-oh, if he thinks the kid didn't do it, well, there's two possibilities. Yeah, right. They all say the same thing, but they tell their parents they didn't do it. But then the father said, I'm very close. I know when he's telling the truth, he's telling the truth. And that gives me cause for concern because the bookmaker, this guy is a man of his word. Like most bookmakers, they live and die by their integrity. A bookmaker that doesn't pay his bets or tries to cheat or do anything like that is out of business. Very much like a restaurateur that can serve a bad meal. One bad meal or one Welsh bet, and you're out of business. So it worried me that he thought, because he was a credible guy, he's a perfect gentleman, a decent guy, and he thought his son was innocent. So I come. The boys, none of them had a record. They were all released with low bail, just nominal bail at that time. And I got to meet the young man. His father brought him to my office. And I sat down and questioned him. I segregated him from his father because of any number of reasons. First of all, I didn't want him to feel that he had to hide the truth because his father was right there. Second, I want to preserve the confidentiality that we would have between lawyer and client if nobody else was there. So I did speak with the young man by himself, and I gave him my famous speech. And my speech is, look, I would like you to tell me what happened, and I'd like you to tell me the truth. I'm not a lie detector. I'm only a person. If you don't tell me the truth, I might not know the difference. However, if you tell me the truth, it's in total confidence. I can't even tell your father. But I will defend you to the end. And if you tell me the truth and there's anything bad in what you say, we'll just avoid it and work around it. On the other hand, if you lie and hide the truth from me, it could explode in our faces in the courtroom, in which case I'll go home, you'll get convicted, and I'll have a nice meal, a drink, and eventually I'll go to bed, and I don't care because you lied and you're guilty anyway. On the other hand, the judge will say, "Oh, there's another defendant that lied to his lawyer. No big deal." But the bad part is you will be convicted. So I leave it to you. So he told me the story, and I asked him to repeat the whole story again from beginning to end. And it never varied in detail or anything else. The kid was straight faced. He never showed anything that would betray anything other than his innocence or portray anything other than his innocence. Now I'm worried. People ask all the time, how can you defend a guilty client? That's actually no problem, which we'll talk about a little further down the line. The problem is if you have to defend somebody that's innocent, because our system of justice is very efficient in grinding out convictions like sausage meat. You may read about a case where somebody got the case dismissed or they walked out of court, they were acquitted. Well, there were 10,000 other cases yesterday, and they were all guilty. And you don't read about those because that's the regular course of business. But it's very, very difficult to be acquitted and to beat the system in any way. Now, and the defense lawyer's job, by the way, is not to get the client off. The defense lawyer's job is to see that the client is properly prosecuted. If you believe in the rule of law, which means if you believe that it's important to have laws rather than no laws, then every client or every defendant gets a lawyer. And the lawyer's job there is to see that that person, your client, is properly prosecuted and that the people who make the rules and enforce the rules follow the rules in doing it. And that's what you want to do. So defending somebody who's guilty is the usual course of business. Unfortunately, most criminal clients are guilty. That's not the problem. And they deserve a defense. You don't have to take every case. If I didn't, I never wanted to defend, and I never defended drug dealers because they hurt people at random. And that was my own personal prohibition. But there's always other guys who will be no problem. Will be happy to represent your client that you didn't want to represent. That's not a problem. So I go along, and we have now this problem on my shoulders of thinking that I've got an innocent guy in my care here. I go to Staten Island for a preliminary appearance where we're arguing and hearings about motions. And one of the motions was challenging the identity by the older lady who owned the store of my client. She had been somewhat shaky in at the lineup, and I knew it because they told me so. And in the courthouse, when I questioned her about identifying my client, she was similarly shaky and hesitant. I said, "Well," I cross-examined, I pressed, and she said, "In fact, after such questioning, I really can't say for sure it was him." I jump up immediately. I say, "Judge, I motion for the case to be dismissed because of the identification or lack of identification testimony on the part of the complainant here." And the judge let us out. And the other three boys were not so fortunate. They stayed in the case. And they stayed in the case for 18 more months, having to deal with this case and the onus of this case hanging over them like a cloud, and then the threat of going to jail. Armed robbery is no joke. And finally, after 18 months, the truth came out. The mom and pop, the old Italian couple, had a son, an only child. He was a junkie. He got his four friends. He set up his mother and father to be robbed by his four friends. And the truth came out in the course of the rest of the proceedings and on the eve of trial, etc., etc. And those boys, their case was dropped. After 18 months, they got dismissed, the other three boys. But they went through a real ordeal for those 18 months. And that's scary. Yeah, a real horror story. Thanks for listening. Come back next week for another episode of Uncommon Law, lessons they don't teach in law school. I'm Judge Rudy Greco. Court is adjourned.